There are two young teenagers, David and Rebecca, who were hiding from the Nazis in a ruined cellar beneath Warsaw Ghetto. And for weeks, they had been hiding in the darkness. One night, as David was returning from scavenging, trying to find badly needed supplies for their survival, he came back with a surprise. He had found a tiny Hanukkah candle and a match. So as David lit the candle, the pair began to blink and saw for what had been weeks for the first time their surroundings and the squalor they were living in. But it was also the first time that they had seen each other in weeks. And what they noted for both of them in that little light was the strength that survived in their eyes. So warmed and awakened by this light, David and Rebecca summoned the courage to make their move towards safety. They said the glimmer of that light, surrounded by so many shadows, seemed to say without words, evil has not yet taken complete dominion. A spark of hope is still left. So this story unfolds, and the teens use the darkness of the world around them to their advantage, and they slip out of the ghetto and then out of Warsaw into the forest where Jewish partisans welcomed them into their fold. Months later, they boarded a boat and, evading Nazi bombs and submarines, arrived in Israel, where they grew up and married each other and built a life. It was one night as their son was playing the Hanukkah game of the dreidel by the cheerful light of their own holiday candles that they told a stranger this story. And Rebecca looked up from this delicious smelling frying pan and said, if it had not been for that light that David brought into our hiding place, we wouldn't be here today. That glimmer of light awakened in us a hope and a strength we didn't know we had. It's the smallest lights that can have a long reach across miles, across years, across generations. See, light illuminates differently at different times, dependent on the degree of darkness. So, what idea of God is Jesus trying to transform for you? What rules is Jesus setting you free from? Where do you struggle to see God in the midst of your own darkness? Jesus' words in chapter 7 and 8 of John happen in this very particular moment. They happen during a festival. This festival is called the Feast of Tabernacles, or sometimes called the Feast of Booths. And this feast was instituted in the book of Leviticus, if you want to look it up and study more about it. And it was a 7-day festival to commemorate the Lord's provision for the Israelites that he had led out of Egypt and into the wilderness. Now, if you remember correctly, in that story, they were led by two things: clouds by day and fire by night, right? Clouds by day and fire by night. And for 7 days in this festival, the Israelites were supposed to build little tents in the community plaza, in the temple plaza, all over, and live in those booths, those tents. Now, the significance of this, right, is as you build your own tent and you have a thatch roof on the top of it, and you're laying there in the middle of the night, there's these beautiful light particles that shine through and catch a glimpse across your face. And in the time of the wilderness moment, It was that light shining at them at the night that reminded them that God was with them. So it's not the sun, but the light of the fiery pillar that led them by day and night. So it was during this festival, right? Imagine this. It was during this moment that Jesus stands up and says, I am the light of the world. For Jews, Jesus was saying, I'm the fulfillment of the Feast of Tabernacles. This thing you've been waiting for, it's finished. I'm it. It's done. So this whole conversation in chapter 7 and 8 that Jesus is having with the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders during the Feast of Tabernacles centers around the question of who really is Jesus. This is the question that John keeps asking us over and over and over, and it's at this moment where Jesus proclaims boldly, I am the light. But what does light do? Here, Jesus is saying, I'm the light that reveals. And it might reveal some of the things that you've been holding for a long time aren't getting you where you want to be. It might reveal the way that you're capturing and holding God in this little box. It's too small of a box because God's already burst out of it. And so it's time to see new ways. Now, just like last week, when Jesus reveals new things, people freak out. Ever been there? Jesus tells you something new that might be out a little bit of a discomfort for you. And you're like, no, that can't be Jesus. Can't be Jesus. So here, instead of it being the people who were sharing a meal with Jesus after feeding the 5,000, now it's the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And chapter 8, verse 13 shows how much that they've just been blinded. They can't see. Here you are, they say, appearing as your own witness. So who's going to validate your testimony? Now, this isn't rude or mean. It's a bunch of lawyers being lawyers. Right? No offense, Rob. Or Jim, or the 1,000 other lawyers in this room. They're just doing their job, right? Because their role was to make sure that nobody spoke out of line for God. And so in their head, what's rolling through over and over and over is Deuteronomy 19:15, which says, a matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So they're saying to Jesus, okay, prophet, okay, rabbi, where are there 2 or 3 witnesses? Hook us up. We want to believe. We want to understand. And Jesus responds in no uncertain terms. Right? If you think Jesus wants to make you comfortable, you're going to be a little uncomfortable. Because he says, even if I testify on my own behalf, my testimony is valid. See, the light of the world can say this in a way that no one else can because the light reveals new things. Anything that is not light needs light to witness to it. But when the light comes, it doesn't need the light to witness to it because it is the light. Right? So have you ever been in a dark place and lit a match? When we were in Minnesota, we had these things called storms where it rained. And frequently, our lights would go out. And the safest place in our house was a basement. In Minnesota, those are things underground where you live. Yeah. So we had one of those, and that's where we would all go. Because if tornadoes or bad weather were coming, that was the safest spot in our house. And so we kept matches around all the time. And when you would light a match, you would just take a deep breath. Right? Because you see more clearly. So fast forward a little bit, you get to chapter 9, because the Pharisees keep kind of pushing Jesus over and over and over again. And this is the sign that John uses to connect to Jesus being the light. There's a blind man in the room, and Jesus gives him sight. And the Pharisees get frustrated by this. Who healed you? It's like, I don't know. Some guy healed me, didn't see who he was, not clear. Comes back a little bit later, Jesus reintroduces himself to us. Now he hears the voice, he recognizes the voice, and he's like, you're the guy. You're the guy who healed me. Hey, here's the guy who heals me. And the Pharisees start this whole back and forth. They bring in the blind man's family, and they're like, are you sure he was blind? Is this like a magic trick? Was it real? And they're like, yes, we're really sure this our son is blind, but that's on him, that's not on me, because they don't want to be in trouble by the Pharisees, right? Nobody wants the lawyers chewing on him. And so they're very clear. And the man says very clearly, you're calling me blind? But I'm telling you, this guy changed my life. So who's really blind in the room? Who's really missing the light? So jump back to chapter 8, verse 20. These are the crucial words for the purpose of this morning. Jesus spoke these words while teaching in the temple area where the offerings were put. Now, here's what we know about that. The place where the offerings were put were in the women's court. There were multiple courts around the temple, and the women's court was a place where men and women and everybody could be, and so you put your offerings there. And during this Feast of Tabernacles, this is where they would bring out these very large lampstands. And they would place these two giant lampstands there, and the role of the temple priests were to climb a ladder 4 or 5 times in a day to fill these bowls with oil. And the wicks of the bowls were made from the remnants of the priest's robes. And so it's here that Jesus is standing amidst these lights, amidst these candles that they've been focusing 7 days around. And Jesus says, this isn't your light. This isn't the light. I'm the light. I'm the light. This is good. This is beautiful that you've been focused around this reality to remember the light, but let me give you a new revelation of what the light really is. See, some of us are walking in our own darkness right now. Our phone isn't ringing the way that we wish it would. You miss a loved one so much and you wish that you could hold their hand just one more time. The stress of life is more than you can feel you can bear. Your family's a mess and it feels like it could fall apart at any time. Your kids or grandkids aren't living the way that you expected they would. And you're trying to find light in things, but it doesn't make sense to you. Our world feels fragile and it feels like darkness is growing and lights are being put out. And yet Jesus is the light of the world. He's saying that if we walk with him, we will never be in darkness again. Now, it doesn't mean you won't be in shadowlands. Right? It doesn't mean there won't be shadows that feel like weight pressing down on you. But it means that even in the shadows, you still have your Hanukkah candle that allows you to have a little bit of light to keep moving forward. You won't live in darkness anymore. And here's what the scripture says, that where that light is, darkness can't exist. You hear that? Darkness doesn't win. I can't tell you what's going to happen in the Ukraine, but this is what I can tell you. That darkness is not going to win in the end. I can't tell you that you're not going to feel pain when you lose that loved one that you've been holding on to so tightly. But what I can tell you is that's not the end. I can't answer all of these questions, but what I can be very clear about is that when Jesus proclaims that he is the light of the world, that was not just for them in that day. It's for us. So all little stresses, right? Like the idea that my son's struggling with reading, that's not the end. It isn't. The marriage that's struggling, keep light in the freaking light because Jesus is there in the midst of that. That grandkid that you think's lost their way, Jesus is fully with them in their darkness. It doesn't win. So I wonder where light is dawning for you. I wonder how your shadowlands are warming and brightening with the light of Christ. And I challenge you, don't give up hope. Scavenge until you find the candle and light it and look at each other and remember that Jesus is with you. Amen.